So the day has been moving very smoothly. It's been a very interesting set of talks, and it's a great pleasure to welcome David Eagleman as our final formal speaker before the discussion. David is an assistant professor of neuroscience and psychiatry at Baylor College of Medicine, which is also where he got his PhD before doing a postdoc at the Salk. He's running a lab for perception and action. And apart from his neuroscience, though, which is quite in line with the spirit of outreach here at the Conte Center, is his incredible work in making science understandable to the public. He's a very well-known author. I've certainly read his books, and most relevant here, he wrote several years ago a book called Wednesday is Indigo Blue, which is very similar to the colored calendar that Joe Martin mentioned. And he's written books. The one I read in particular was various creative, interesting thoughts on what happens after we die. I think it's been turned into an opera. And then Incognito, one of his more recent books on neuroscience. And some of you may see him on PBS. I think just the other night he was on the air telling us about how the brain works. So we're really happy to have him here. And David will tell us about lessons from large-scale data analysis through some very clever use of the web. So, welcome.
All right, thanks. And thanks for being here, y'all. I think I'm supposed to hook this up. So, can everyone hear me? Is this on? Turn it on. All right. The old turn it on trick. Okay. So, it's really a pleasure to be back out here. What I figured I'd tell you about is a little bit of how we got to now in the synesthesia world, and what data is emerging from having large-scale data to mine. So essentially, when I got interested in synesthesia many years ago, at least a decade ago, it was very difficult to find any way to quantitatively test synesthesia in a way where we had high-resolution data. I mean, there were all sorts of things of actually, what Simon Baron-Cohen introduced was the revised test of genuineness, where you ask colors over and over, and that was a real inspiration for me. But still, if people give you color names like red or purple or green or something, it's hard to have high-resolution data to start doing quantified analyses with. And so I saw a real need for that. And so what I did in 2007 is I launched the Synesthesia Battery. And this is, of course, free and open to the public. And what it allows us to do is rigorously test for synesthesia and quantify lots of details about it. So many of you know about this, but for those of you who don't, I'll give you the 1-second version here. It relies, as Simon pointed out, on this idea of consistency. So the way it works is you're presented with some random, let's say, letter or number, depending on the type of synesthesia you have. So let's say the letter T appears, and you drag this slider around to get any different hue, and you drag that slider around to get any saturation. And so you can take as much time as you want, and you find exactly the color that best matches your synesthetic percept for whatever the letter is that's being presented. And then you're presented with the next letter or number at random, and so on. And what happens is you see each digit and letter 3 times each in random order. And so the idea is, what I'm doing here is I'm plotting the answers from a synesthete. I'm plotting each letter in the color that was given. The idea is if you're a real synesthete, it's really easy every time you see a particular letter, like J for this synesthete. She picks the same shade of green and so on. But I then ran a bunch of control participants, and I said, look, just pretend you're synesthetic. Use free association, use your memory, anything you want. And when they try to do it, it's really hard to remember what color you answered 50 trials ago if you're just faking it. And what these bars next to the show is just the variation in color space between their 3 different answers. And so for a synesthete, you can see that they have a lot of consistency. And for people who are trying really hard to fake it, it's difficult. And so what we can do is separate out synesthetes from malingerers, and that's how we know who is genuinely synesthetic, and it allows us to quantify a number of things, which I'll tell you about. I'll just mention that we've got this now launched in 8 different languages and all kinds of interesting alphabets. I'm showing Chinese and Hebrew here. And we test many forms of synesthesia this way. Weekdays, months, Chinese numerals, notes of the scale, instrument timbres. So we've got lots and lots of things that we can measure by this consistency testing. I should also mention we also have many different layers of testing, which I'm not going to show here, but just as an example with the alphabet, after you've entered in all of your colors for your letters in the way that I showed you, then there's a speeded reaction time test where a letter is flashed at you. Let's say I flash the letter J in red. So all you have to do is answer as quickly as you can whether that matches or doesn't match. And for somebody who's really synesthetic, it's easy. Let's say their J is green. That's easy. They say, oh, that doesn't match. And what I'm doing is measuring the accuracy and reaction time. And that's another way that we can cleanly separate someone who's really synesthetic from somebody who's trying to fake it. So we've got all these different ways of doing things. We've also got a way of measuring in 3D space the structured sequences where people see things like, as Dean Martin said, where there are things like the months in three-dimensional space. So when I first started in synesthesia, most of the papers in the literature just had a handful of subjects, just a few subjects, and we've been able to change that in a big way. So we've now rigorously verified over 23,000 synesthetes, and we have great detail on all their answers, and so this has allowed us to make a lot of progress in terms of understanding things about what it is, and also the genetics and the neuroimaging. I think I'm not going to have time to talk about those latter two, but I'd be happy to talk about it during questions. What I want to mention now is where we've been going with analyzing the data in terms of the behavior. So one of the first things that we had to do, and actually I started asking this question about how the different forms of synesthesia cluster. I started asking this actually because we're working on the genetics of synesthesia. As has been mentioned today, it runs in family trees. But what I realized is we really have no way of knowing whether all these different forms of synesthesia that we see are genetically related, or if they're just completely different issues that we're lumping under the same umbrella of synesthesia. So we did a large-scale factor analysis to see if you have such and such type, what's the chances that you also have such and such type, and so on. We went through everything, and I'll give you the punchline here, which is that it breaks out into clusters, meaning if you have colored letters, you're really likely to have colored numbers or colored weekdays or colored months, but you're no more likely than anyone else to have sound to smell or vision to smell. These are all things that are, these all have certain characteristics, and these are all things that trigger colors. This is about the audition here. It's about the chemical senses there. It turns out that this is how they fall out into clusters. And so I have a suspicion that this means at least five different genetic bases for something like this. But it may be, even within a cluster, it may be that there's lots of different ways that you can end up there. But here's what I want to emphasize, is this one, which we named some years ago colored sequence synesthesia, because the thing that numbers and letters, weekdays and months have in common is they're all overlearned sequences. So this is the most common form, and I'm going to restrict today's talk to this. What's up with colored sequences? So one of the hypotheses that's always been in the field is that maybe what's going on is you've got these overlearned sequences, and neurally they are doing more crosstalk than usual with areas involved in color, for example. And so it's been thought, I think it's the baseline hypothesis that most people just take on board, is that the connectivity is random, meaning that the synesthetic colors are idiosyncratic. They're unique from person to person. So one person's alphabet will be different than another person's alphabet. So what I want to tell you about today is putting this assumption under the spotlight and asking, are there patterns that are hiding in the colors in what we see that we can pull out once we have many thousands of data points? And so that's what we're going to look at. So I want to mention that other people have asked this question about, are there patterns to the colors? And so these are just a few papers and a few observations that people have made, which is that, often there's a lot of red for A, there's blue or brown for B, C is yellow. And I think Daphne mentioned that for infants this morning. For little kids, that C tends to be yellow. But these are some reported numbers from these other papers. But the thing is, when I looked at that, I thought, well, what is A when it's not red? Because most of the time it's not. And so what I've done here, these are just color histograms. The y-axis is logarithmic, so, oops. What the color history, it'll come back in a second. What the color histograms show is that it's actually quite distributed. So what different synesthetes assign for their A, their B, their C, their D, and so on. There are things where, for example, red is overrepresented here in A and yellow for C and so on. But what you see also is that it's represented throughout the spectrum. And so I wanted to really address the issue of how much we can predict about synesthetes' colors, and more specifically, if there's relationships between the colors for an individual. So let's say I'm a synesthete, and my A is whatever, and my B is whatever. What does that tell us? Can we make a prediction about what my C will be and what my D will be, given whatever my particular fingerprint is? So in order for me to tell you how I do this, I just want to introduce you to a concept called multidimensional scaling, which is it's just a mathematical procedure, but it's kind of like magic, and here's how it works. So do you guys remember these old road atlases where you have different cities and then you have the number of miles between them? You remember these things? So you can tell how many miles between Seattle and Chicago, and you can figure that out. Well, this is a distance matrix, and it turns out you can take a distance matrix and using this simple technique, it will tell you how far apart everything needs to be, because essentially everything here is constrained by everything else. So Denver needs to be a certain distance from Chicago and needs to be a certain distance from LA and San Francisco and so on. The orientation that you get out is random, so that doesn't matter. You can rotate it any way you want, but what you see is that you get a map out of it. If you just have the distances, you can figure out what things are close to what. So you know that Boston, New York, and DC are close to each other and far away from LA. Okay, so the reason I'm telling you about multidimensional scaling is because we can do the same thing in color space. So if I take somebody's colors and I look at them in a particular color space, so their A is here in color space and their B is here and so on, I can make a distance matrix. So this is A through Z in 1 through 9 and A through Z in 1 through 9. And what I'm looking at is what is the distance between every color and every other color for their different letters. And then we pass that distance matrix through multidimensional scaling. And what you get out of it is in color space, the distances between things. So just so we understand, so like S and D and 3 come out close here for this particular synesthete. So if we look at S and D and 3, you see they're all green. They're all close in color space, but they're very far from, B, that's an F and an R and a 5 is in there. So F and R and 5, you see these are all close together in color space, but far from these other ones. And so you can look at something like this and understand how far apart they are in color space. So here is the average. That matrix represents the average distances in color space for several thousand synesthetes. And what you get out of it when you do the multidimensional scaling is a pattern like this. Now, what I want to point out is there are features in this, and I'm going to just spend 30 seconds giving you a sense of how we do the mathematics on, how we do the statistics, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but just, I don't want to go into details, I just want to give you a sense of it. But one of the things I want to point out is there are certain clusters that fall out where many things are close in color space to one another. And here's my 30-second tangent just to show you how we prove these things. So let's say I take all the synesthetes and I randomly divide the data into thirds. So these are different people now. What you can see is that the structure of the distance matrices looks about the same. And if I do multidimensional scaling on these different ones, what I'll show you in a second is that these patterns come out the same across 3 completely independent groups of synesthetes. And then if I shuffle the data within a synesthete, I just take whatever colors and letters and I shuffle those around, all the structure in that goes away. And so if I'm just comparing the original data to the shuffle data, what you see in the original data is that even across groups, these particular clusters stay close together, whereas in the control group, they're all spread far apart. So that's how we show this. But let me give you the simpler version of it here, which is that there are clusters like E and F and 3 that tend to be close to each other. In color space. So here's some synesthete. Here's a different synesthete. And the thing that's important to notice here is, for this synesthete, those are green. For this synesthete, they're orange or red. But so it doesn't tell us what it's going to be, but what it suggests is that if we know the color of your E and your F, we can make a pretty good guess about what your 3 is, irrespective of what the details are. So we find this with EF3, we find this with BP8. Here are 2 separate synesthetes. Again, the particulars of the cluster of the colors are randomized, are random, but the clusters hang together. H, N, Z, and T, these well above average, hang together in terms of their colors. I should mention something, which is this won't apply to every synesthete. So if you're a synesthete sitting in the audience and you think, wait a minute, that's not true for me, this is true over thousands of people. This emerges as something that's happening statistically. So for many, possibly even most, there are these clusters, but it won't be for everybody. K, M, W, and X tend to hang with the same color. And then there's a big cluster with T, L, 7, C, and Y. Irrespective of what they are, they hang together. And what we see often when we go really into the data is that a lot of times you see multiple clusters in the same subject. So here's the KMWX, and here's the BPN8, and here's the EFN3. So even within a subject, we see these things hanging together. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, what's probably struck you by now is there's something similar about the shapes here of these particular graphemes. And so there seems to be some attraction when things look similar in shape space that they end up getting the same synesthetic color. Now, if we look at some individual subject here, you might say, well, look, the fact that B and P are close in color space, maybe that's not such a big deal, because what if this person had linguistic influence where B is blue and P is purple? And the answer would be, that's probably right. There probably was a linguistic influence there. What's interesting is that 8 gets dragged along with that. So you might also point out, by the way, that Y and L are both yellow, and there may well be a linguistic anchoring that's happening there. And I agree with that. What it doesn't explain immediately, though, is why T and 7 get dragged along with that. So here's what I think is going on, is that there's this linguistic anchoring that happens with, let's say, Y being yellow and P being purple and B being blue. But then what happens is that similar shapes get dragged along with that. So that's the idea. And what I'm in the middle of right now, I really just started, is this issue of looking at other alphabets and whether there's this sort of shape influence there too, and there appears to be. So you see these things that I'm highlighting, things that have similar sort of structure to them tend to be similar in color. I hope to finish this up over the next month or so across several different alphabets. Okay. So that's point one, is that there appears to be the shape attraction that's anchored often with some sort of linguistic imprinting. So what I've been mentioning so far is which things are similar in color space, but we can ask the flip side of that question too, which is which things stay far apart. And something that I noticed at the beginning that I thought was kind of weird and interesting is that if you look at again, this is spread out in color space, so think of this like distances between cities, but this is now how different one color is from another. The thing to notice is that A and B and C are essentially always as far apart as possible. And if you look at 2, 3, 4, you'll see also that they're as far apart as possible. I'm going to come back to 0 and 1 later because that's an interesting separate thing. But what you see is that things at the beginning of these sequences, it's like they try to stay as far apart in color space as possible. And so there appears to be, as you go farther into the alphabet, there's sort of this diminishing difference. So things start, let's say you're A, whatever your color is for A, it can be different from person to person, but whatever it is for A, your B is going to be really different, and your C is going to be really different from that. But by the time you're down to the W's and Q's and X's and Z's, they're all looking similar to one another, and I'll explain why they start looking similar to one another. But anyway, so this is the diminishing differentiation, which is that as you go through the sequence, your brain is sort of less enthusiastic about making sure that these things are as far apart as possible. So what I mentioned about as you get later in the alphabet, what's happening is the reason those are looking more similar is because actually the saturation is diminishing. So A and B and C are really far apart, but as you go further and further, by the time you get to the end, everything's just clumped up in the middle. And if you look at saturation of the colors, it's just going down through the sequence. And by the way, you find the same thing with numbers. Again, ignoring 0 and 1 for just a moment, what you see is that 2 and 3 and 4 are really bright, and then 5 is a little less so, and 6 is a little less so. And by the time you're getting to 8 and 9, there's just less color going on there, less saturation that's happening. Okay. So I'm going to tie all these different threads together, and I want to point out one more issue, which is that something that's always struck me as interesting about colored letter synesthesia is that, a synesthete will come in and say, oh, A is this and B is this and so on. And then we'll get to some letter, like Q or whatever, and they'll say, oh, Q doesn't have a color. And so I've always been wondering why do some letters end up uncolored? So what I did over several thousand synesthetes then is just looked at which letters have no color as the answer when people say, oh, that one does not have a color. So here it is in alphabetical order, and what you can see is that the number of letters that go uncolored, it gets more common as you get later in the alphabet. There are some outliers which we'll talk about. And if I take that same data and I just rank order them, so that's the most likely to have no color all the way to the least likely to have no color. What I did is I wanted to know whether this had something to do with the amount of practice that you get at each letter, or instead if it has to do with the order of the alphabet, which might indicate the order in which you learn the letters. And so I'll just tell you very quickly, actually, let me explain the axes first here, which is, so what I'm doing on this axis is I'm just taking this result and flipping it. So you're most likely to have color here all the way down to no color this way. And so I'm just correlating that against the order in the alphabet or against the frequency in the English language. What's interesting and weird is that they both correlate statistically significantly, because there is a relationship between that and that. But the one that's the one that's really statistically strong is the issue about the order in the alphabet. So it's as though when you're first learning a sequence, there's color going with A and B and C. These are really bright, separate colors. And as you go further in the alphabet, you are less and less likely to have colors for something. Okay, so what I've been telling you then is that progressive sequences, whether it's letters or numbers or whatever, they tend to stake out differentiating colors for as long as they can, but then things start winding down. Okay, but now I want to return to this point I brought up about those outliers, 0 and 1, which has always been a subject of great interest to many of us, is what's going on with those outliers. So, so what I'm plotting here for the numbers is just whenever somebody said that it was any shade of gray, so I mean white or gray or black, anything in there. You remember with the color palette, there's 16 million different colors you can choose from, so I take a stretch down the middle of that color space where it's anything gray or white or black. Okay, so what you see is that people are much more likely to find zeros and ones, some grayscale color, but now if I divide that out into white, gray, and black, what you see is something clear, which is that it's almost always white, and it's only later numbers that are really becoming black. So in other words, it's not that 0 and 1 are going uncolored, and you could call them white or black or gray. It's that almost always it's white. So early numbers tend to be white, later numbers tend to be black. Now, keep this in mind, and now let's look at the issue of months. So what we see is that months being some shade of gray, anywhere from white to black, you see that middle months tend to be the least likely to be gray, and you might think, oh, well, that perhaps has to do with bright summertime colors, and the winter is darker. But if we break it down again into white, gray, and black, what you see is that early months tend to be white, and later months tend to be black. So in other words, this part here is because things are white, and this part here is because they're black. And so I just want to emphasize this point by just plotting it a different way, which is that whenever you have a sequence, later elements in the sequence tend to be black. So what I'm plotting here on all three of these is the probability over thousands of synesthetes that this element will be white, and on the y-axis is the probability that it'll be black. And what you see is that for later elements of the sequence, they're much more likely to be black. Okay, so I want to emphasize that part. And then at the beginnings of the sequences, things tend to be white. Now here's the thing. 0 and 1, by the way, this is saturation and lightness, so things up in this quadrant are white. It means they have low color saturation and they're bright. It's just things up in that upper left quadrant are white. Here's the thing. 0 and 1 are white, and a hypothesis that has been a favorite of many of us for a long time is, okay, is it because it's the beginning of a sequence, or is it because these are natural shapes? In other words, lines and circles are something that you see from the very beginning before you learn that they have any sort of meaning to them as symbols. And because they're natural shapes, maybe they don't get a color when you're learning the number sequence later. Well, here's how I went about addressing this issue. I looked at, here's weekdays, and here's months. And what you see is that Saturday and Sunday tend to be white, and January tends to be white. These are real outliers off the line there. And so what you might think is, okay, well, it's the beginnings of sequences that tend to be white. Maybe it's about the beginning of something. But then there's this question about, all right, well, what about the letters? Why are I and O also white? Okay, so here are the two hypotheses, I think. Hypothesis one is that things that are at the beginning of a sequence, these have whiteness, and I and O inherit that whiteness because they happen to look like 0 and 1. And hypothesis two is that because I and O and 0 and 1 are natural shapes, they're white, and things like the weekdays in the month inherit that whiteness because they're at the beginning of the sequence. Okay, so those are the two hypotheses. And so there's a simple way to test that, which is, do the letters O and I inherit their properties from 0 and 1? And so I thought, well, maybe what I could do is look at people who have synesthesia for letters, but they don't have synesthesia for numbers. And that way I could answer that. So what I'm showing here is, for synesthetes that have letters and numbers, here's the proportion of time that this ends up uncolored, I and O and 0 and 1. If you only have letter synesthesia, it turns out that those are uncolored just as much of the time. And if you only have numbers, it's the same sort of thing here. So what does this mean? It means you're not, for these people here, they're not inheriting their colors of O and I from whatever they think 0 and 1 is, because they don't even have number synesthesia. So this supports the natural shape hypothesis because it suggests that it's something about being a line in a circle is the issue. Okay, and we're looking at that further by looking at things like Chinese numerals and doing studies there. It turns out, just as one example, that in Chinese numbers, 7 ends up being uncolored a lot of the time, and that's 7 right there. It's essentially a cross, which is another simple shape. And of course the 1 does, and also the 10 does, which is this one down here. It's another cross shape. Okay, so we're able to look at this in other alphabets too. And also, and here, for example, in Greek, we find a lot of synesthetes who have uncolored letters of the same simple shapes. And so that's what suggests to us that across languages, natural shapes tend to go uncolored. And here's an example in Hebrew where these two letters, which are essentially straight lines at the end of a word, those also go uncolored. Okay, so there's just one more piece I want to tell you, which is I want to come back to this issue I mentioned about imprinting, for example, with linguistic imprinting. So, the fact that Y ends up being yellow a lot, or B being blue, or R being red, what this suggests is it's not that it's not that people become synesthetes because of imprinting, but their particular synesthetic associations can be influenced by what they're exposed to. And so I did a large-scale analysis recently with a couple of my colleagues at Stanford, Nathan Whithoff and Jonathan Winauer, and we noticed a pattern in the data, which I'm just highlighting in red here. So these are bunches of synesthetes through time. This is by year of birth. And what we notice is that there's this group of synesthetes born around this time where about 6% of the whole subject pool of synesthetes all showed essentially the same colored alphabet. They had the same colored alphabet as each other. And the reason this matters is because of what I said at the beginning, which is that it's been thought that synesthesia is idiosyncratic and everybody should have their own random alphabet. We found that a bunch of people didn't have random alphabets, but instead, if we look at these 400 subjects, these are their alphabets plotted out. And what I'm showing here is the modal color. In other words, the most common color for that letter for all 400 of these synesthetes. And so all of these people born in that period had that sort of thing, and it turns out these colors match the Fisher-Price magnet set. And this is something that Winauer and Whithoff had noticed earlier, but they had a very small sample group, and so their finding was taken as being intriguing, but nobody was really buying it because it just seemed like it was such a rare thing. And maybe it didn't speak to synesthesia more generally. But it turns out that we now know that fully 6% of the people on the synesthesia battery seem to have been influenced by these colors. And by the way, there are a couple ways that we know, or at least we think we can know, that they were influenced by this particular magnet set. First, for many of them, we've been able to get childhood pictures. So this is a grown woman here who happened to have a picture on Christmas when she got that set back in the late 80s. And here's that slide I showed from before. What we find is that nobody in the entire synesthesia database born before this time has more than 10 matches to that data set. But then lots of people do, and these dashed lines here show when the toy was on the market. It was a very popular toy right at that period, and so lots of people born and exposed to that seem to have imprinted on it. Okay, so actually, wait, let me skip that and just do it here. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize and then answer any questions about anything. So what we're looking at is when we look at thousands of synesthetes at the same time, we can really pull out patterns that wouldn't be possible otherwise. So I showed you about shape attraction, which we see across languages, things of similar shape and of similar color. Linguistic anchoring seems to be happening there. So B might be blue and P might be purple, and then 8 gets dragged along for the ride. I showed you how natural shapes like zeros and ones across languages tend to go uncolored, presumably because you learn them before you ever learn that they carry symbolic meaning. You see what circles and lines are. And the other thing that I mentioned here is that because 0 and 1 goes uncolored, a lot of other things get dragged along for the ride there, like weekdays and months at the beginning of sequences often are uncolored or white. And then finally, I told you about the Fisher-Price magnet set, and as an environmental influence, just to be clear, it's not that the magnets caused synesthesia, but for people who are already synesthetically predisposed, they seem to have imprinted on that. And so, one of the issues is that synesthesia doesn't appear to result from random crosstalk, which is what many of us thought years ago, but instead there seems to be a lot of non-randomness to it, and that's how we pull out these patterns in the data. Okay, so that's all I'll say, and I'll answer questions about anything.
So the idea about the matching between the colors and numbers, I'm thinking about how much cross-cultural generality has. You already showed that some Greek letters, but is there any more, such as Spanish letters, that may apply, may or may not apply the idea? And secondly, what about level of difficulty in the concept. For example, 1 and 2 are the most simple concepts.
Could you speak into the microphone, please? Thank you.
Okay, I can repeat the question. So as far as this issue about across alphabets, that's exactly what we're analyzing right now. We should be done very soon. But the main alphabets that are quite different from the one used in English is Greek and Hebrew and Chinese. We've got those. We're about to launch Korean also. We have the synesthesia battery in other languages like Italian and Spanish and French, but those use the same alphabet. So there's nothing more I can get out of the shape hypothesis there. And then as far as what you were saying about the concept of, what's interesting about that is that 0 and 1 tend to always go together in being white or uncolored. 1 is a very simple hypothesis, but 0 is quite a difficult one, and of course wasn't even invented by civilizations until recently. So, so those seem to have some interesting differences in how simple they are. And by the way, I'll just point out one thing about the Chinese numerals, because I thought this was an interesting screw up on my part, which is, hang on, almost there. The reason I went after Chinese numerals is because I thought, look, 1 here is a natural shape in the sense that it's a line, but the 0 is really complicated. And so my expectation was that I could address the natural shape hypothesis this way. But it turns out, and anyone correct me if you're a native Chinese speaker and think otherwise, but what a bunch of Chinese speakers then told me is that you don't actually learn that symbol for 0 until later. You actually use the 0 symbol in schools. So that it turns out that might not be the best way to test this. Yeah.
You keep talking about 0 and 1, but doesn't the body of evidence suggest it might be just shapes, like which I'm going to call O and I, and then they get mapped onto 0 and 1? And one reason I think about it that way is that when we tested toddlers and we called the shapes an O and an I, they thought they were white. And at that time, the child, of course, had no concept of 0 at all. They understand round and O long before they understand 0.
So this is interesting. So let me make sure I got it. So I'm also my evidence also points to the natural shapes issue. But what you're saying, let me just make sure I got it, which is that even before they learn the rest of the alphabet, even before they know what letters are, they still think a line and a circle are white.
Yeah, and it's based on shape. So when we repeated the experiment and said, I'm looking for my friend who looks like this,
Okay.
and we showed them the shape, we didn't call it an O or an I, they searched in the white box for what we would call an O and an I.
Oh, that's really cool. Okay, cool. Thanks for telling me that. So that would modify what I spoke about only in the sense that I said the hypothesis was that you learn those shapes before you learn other alphabet symbols, and so those are sort of already taken up. But you're saying they're just naturally white. For what percentage of kids? Like all of them, or just for kids?
They're group experiments. So all I can say is, it's like your large database. More than expected by chance, search for white. And they think, so I think about it as natural shapes. These are continuous. There's no abrupt change. There's no T-junction. And the letters that toddlers think are black are X and Z, which are sort of, maximally discontinuous. They change direction. And so maybe the first split for kids is things that are amoeboid, versus things that are jagged. It's almost Malumum, but
Cool.
Tahiti all over again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so it's really interesting. I get that. Okay. Yeah. And here's the probability of being white, and you see these guys are outliers here, and probability of being black here. You have X and Z.
Yeah, the X and Z are black.
Yeah. And the hypothesis that I'm suggesting is that these other things. That's okay. So you're saying these kids call X and Z black even before they've learned the sequential nature in the alphabet. This is. I think we.
At age 2.5.
Okay. That's really interesting.
And we tested their knowledge of the alphabet. It was simple at that age.
Okay, cool.
We tested point to the X, point to the Z. We asked them to point out the letters as we named them, and they didn't know them at that age.
Here's the thing, and maybe this would be a better, longer discussion during the panel that happens right after this. We're having the panel now, yeah. But the issue is, I don't think that the X and the Z are maximally discontinuous, because there are other letters that are that could be seen as just as discontinuous. Just as an example, HNTZ and several other clusters hang together. Because they have certain shape similarities. Hold on, screw it. Let me pick a different slide here that'll make this easier. Here, these are all essentially simple junctions, essentially like a T or an L junction. These are more complicated. These are also more complicated. So let me ask you this: do your infants also call those black? Have you tested the K and M?
Haven't tested them yet.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Obviously, we need to.
Yeah. All right.
So David, obviously I'm a fan of the shape similarity hypothesis because it really links it back to the visual processing of the letters. But this morning I talked a lot about how we eventually acquire a brain system that becomes specialized for reading, is that we tie those visual orthographic representations to a phonemic representation and learn to eventually do it so fluently that we can do it in both directions. And I pointed out Jules' data showing the sort of emergence of the stabilization of synesthetic colors. So my question for you, currently you have in your model basically order of acquisition effects, order in the sequence, you have shape similarity. One question, how much variance do those factors account for? And the other, do you see evidence for phonemic similarity? So the sounds of either the letter names, B, P, C, D, versus W. Do you see either letter names or the sounds that in English, for example, we associate with those letters? So A versus E. Do you see anything like that in this data? Currently, you're showing us all shape and order of acquisition.
Yeah, it's a terrific question. We have not analyzed that, okay. But that would be super simple to do. And I assume, you or someone must have a phonemic similarity distance matrix. You know, how similar phonemes are. I could do that work, but I'd rather not if someone has it. And then it would be plug and play to just see if that correlates better.
Yeah, I could send you some stuff
cool,
that
that's
I did
great.
All the way back when I was still in San Diego.
Terrific, back in the day. All right. Yeah, thanks. That's a lovely thing.
So in your color painting research, they are actually 2D or R's. So the subjects might be exposed to the D or R more often than others alphabets. So does these reflect to your models, and in the same sense that for those people who are playing with the color paintings, they might use A and E more often than Y or Z. So could these trends be also reflected into your models?
I'm afraid I missed the first word that you said about R and P.
Like the color painting, because they the last aisles is like D R something. So in that painting they are actually two D's and like two R's. I mean in that products, in the real products of the. The color paintings.
The color paintings?
Right.
I don't know what you're referring to. I'm sorry, because I want to understand this question. If anyone.
In the last few slides.
In the last
real
few
products. I'm sorry, I haven't played that before. But. Right.
Oh, these. You talking about these?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this one. Yeah.
Okay.
So you actually have 2D and 2E. Yeah. So those subjects might got exposed to the D and E more often than other alphabets. So could it be those sort of
Oh.
factors too?
Oh, you mean down
Yeah,
here?
yeah.
These extras? Is that what you're talking about?
Right, yeah.
Oh, okay, thanks. Now I get what you're talking about. And so you're saying because there are some extras here, they got more exposed to some than others?
Right, right.
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't think I can look into that a little bit more deeply, but I can imagine. I mean, the way these get, I had this when I was a kid too. The way they get played with is it's all just smushed around on the floor or on the fridge, and you're just moving them all around. The reason I didn't catch your question is because I'd never noticed that until just now when you said that, that they're extra letters. I don't know if there's anything special about these letters down here where they're sort of more strongly represented, if that's your question. But that is analyzable.
Any fan of Wheel of Fortune will tell you these are the most common letters in English. And so whenever they give you like the free letters, like in the bonus round, it's always R, S, T, L, and E.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's why, by the way, that's exactly why I analyzed this issue about, if you notice the red axis here is the frequency in English. So how often you're exposed to certain letters. And that actually didn't explain, maybe this is the answer to your question, that it didn't actually explain better which letters end up with no color. The stronger correlation was with the order of the alphabet.
So, go ahead.
I was just wondering if what you see also is works for lowercase letters when you ask people with synesthesia. Do they have the same synesthesia for uppercase as for lowercase letters?
That's a good question, and I haven't done that because everything that we've done here on the synesthesia battery is all uppercase. So that needs to be done where we look at a matrix of distances between lowercase letters. My suspicion, but actually Ed would probably have more insight into this than I would. Is it the case that kids learn the uppercase letters first? Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, and that's what you really learn up on, and you draw with a crayon a million times and so on, and then you learn the lowercase ones. It would be worth trying, though, to look at a distance matrix of similarities between the lowercase. Yeah. I'll bet this will come up in the panel. Maybe you'll have more to say about this during the panel. So we'll come back to that. Simon, yeah.
Yeah. So, the question I asked Daphne after her talk was about simple versus complex synesthesia, because I guess your whole presentation was on colored letters. Which I'm calling the simple case because there's only 26 of them. So if you were taking a kind of learning account, you could quite easily, learn to associate and memorize colors and letters. There's only 26. Whereas, the first case we studied had colored words. So, her vocabulary is thousands of items. So learning becomes, there still could be a role for it, but it's much more complex. So I guess my first question is, does your online synesthesia battery only test colored letters, or does it test other kinds of synesthesia, more complex synesthesia?
It tests many different forms of synesthesia, but the thing, so I don't know who your first subject was, but are you certain that she didn't have colored letters?
Yeah, so we analyzed, we wanted to see whether, when she described Moscow as being purple with tinges of spinach green, we wanted to check, was it because it was the letter M that was driving the color of the word Moscow? But there was nothing obvious, no pattern. It wasn't the first letter or the first phoneme. It really was, each word had a unique color. So you can sort of see the complexity, it's like thousands of entries, and she was still 100% consistent when she was retested.
Did she also have colored letters? I mean, that was part of the. If you just asked her what color M was, did she have an answer to that?
I don't know that she had colored letters, but I think she specifically had colored words, and we did explore whether she had colored anything else like sounds or music or whatever. Hers was very specifically lexical.
Okay.
And so when you have discovered the Fisher-Price phenomenon, as if we could call it that, it could be a very different type of phenomenon. That a whole generation of people got exposed to the opportunity to learn colored letters, and sure enough they did. But is that the same thing as other kinds of synesthesia?
I can only, okay, these are all terrific points, and we can discuss them further at the panel. I can only tell you my own experience, having now studied thousands of synesthetes individually and then tens of thousands online, is that I haven't met someone who has what you described, which is colored words that aren't related to what their colored
Yeah, I
letters
noticed
are.
in your factor analysis that colored words or even colored hearing didn't figure in your 5 clusters. So
Right. What I mean is, I'll be interested to see what the other researchers have to report on this. But I'm just saying, when I talk with synesthetes, which happens, once you become a synesthesia researcher, at every cocktail party, somebody wants to share their own personal experience about something. But I haven't met a subject like that who has colored words, but does not have a colored alphabet that's underlying that.
So the colored alphabet form seems to be much more common. And, it may be for less interesting reasons, this kind of learning account. So, go ahead.
It might be simpler than words, but I don't think we should so readily attribute it to learning. I showed this morning evidence from 3- and 4-year-old children. I only showed a 4-year-old who had colored letters. She was consistent over months, but children of profs in the department without synesthesia age 4 could not remember the colors over a period of 2 weeks. They could not learn color associations, whereas the child with colored grapheme synesthesia, it wasn't as consistent as we expect from adults, but the control group was random, and that child showed consistency. So I don't think we should so readily say it's simple and maybe it's learned because there are only 26 letters. 3- and 4-year-olds cannot learn colors for letters and be consistent over time, even if they're children of profs.
Do you have a final comment? Sure. Final question, is that okay? Okay, this is sort of tangentially related to the idea or question about learning, but in this case, implicit learning. So one question that's been raised recently with that viral dress photo that people can see as yellow and gold or blue and black is whether exposure in your upbringing to different hues in light, whether that you're a person who lives closer to the equator or to the north, or someone who spends most of your time awake in the day or in the evening, might bias your perception of especially blue colors. And I imagine you must have, or might have, location data on these participants whose IP addresses are being logged as they sign into your website. I've wondered if you do have that data and if you've looked at all at geographic variation and the types of color bias these people have.
It's a lovely question. We haven't. We have everyone's IP address, but that only tells us where they're taking the test or where they live right now.
Sure.
And we ask people what their native language, we ask lots of questions, but we haven't done that question of, hey, did you spend your first 10 years in one place and what was the latitude of it?
Sure. Though you'd imagine with this big of a data set, that might be noise in the. Yeah,
good one. I mean, look, I'll just tell you my guess on that. I was watching my nephew when he was learning the alphabet, and he had a can of a box of Crayolas, and so it was time to practice the A. So he sort of randomly picks a crayon and writes A with this crayon 10 billion times, and then it's time to practice B. So he puts it back and picks another crayon and then writes B with that new crayon 1 billion times. And so it may be that there is imprinting that's happening, but we'll never figure out what the imprinting was because it might have been a random selection of something or a quilt in a teacher's classroom or whatever it is. And the reason I mention that is because let's say it is the box of Crayolas or whatever it is, then the latitude, if there is an effect there, it's going to get pretty diluted out anyway. But it would be easy enough to try if we get a number of people to tell us the latitude at which they grew up. Yeah. Thanks.
So thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. I think we'll continue the discussion at the panel. If we can just thank David again.
Thanks.